there anyone here who didn't know who that was and is prepared to admit it? One person. Well done. Well done. We'll figure there might be some more. That was President George W. Bush. He was president of the United States about 2 or 3 presidents ago, and that was him being interviewed on ABC TV in America 10 years after the events now known as 9/11. So it was 2011, and he was being interviewed about the so-called War on Terror and how the War on Terror had been going. And as you heard, the interview took a very interesting turn when the interviewer, just before our clip began, started asking questions about God. George Bush, you might know, still is, as far as I know, well known as a professing Christian. And it was interesting because, as you saw, George Bush said a number of things, made a number of claims about God. When asked if Muslims and Christians worship or believe in the same God, George Bush said yes, although they are taking different routes, or a different route, of course, to God. When asked if Christians and Muslims pray to the same God, same answer, yes, but they're taking different routes. When asked if Osama bin Laden, the notorious terrorist who was alive then, no longer alive, also prayed to the same God as Christians, well, George Bush said no. He prays to a false God. George Bush spoke, probably for the first time, very openly and candidly in a public interview like that about God. And you won't be surprised to know that it was very controversial, not least because of what he said about God and that whole claim that Muslims and Christians believe in the same God. That is a controversial claim. He was criticised from all quarters in America. There were those who criticised him for talking about God at all. He should have just kind of passed the question and done the politician thing and just ignored the question. There were those, of course, pastors who wrote at the time, were interviewed on TV and on radio, who spoke out against what George Bush said, vehemently claiming that Muslims and Christians do not worship the same God. Then there were those, one in particular, I can't remember who it was, who said we need to just give George Bush a break. He's the commander-in-chief, he's not the theologian-in-chief, and thank goodness about that. But, of course, whether you agree with George Bush or not comes down to your view of God. It comes down to your view of who you think God is and where you've derived that view from. Where have you got your view of God from? Now, I happen to think George Bush was wrong. I think Muslims and Christians have two very different ideas about who God is and what he is like. They are actually mutually exclusive. There is nothing remotely similar about them. If you want to explore that with me later, I'd be happy to do that. But for one, maybe 2, 3, think of the Trinity, a core doctrine of the Christian faith, that there is one God who is 3 persons. Or the notion that God became man in Christ, the glory of the Christian faith, completely and utterly rejected in Islam. And that's just 2 to start with. But the controversy which George Bush's comments caused does raise some interesting questions for us about the nature and the character of God and of what we can know of him. Who is God? What is he like? What are his purposes in the world? And probably most importantly, how are we supposed to respond to God? Now, these are not insignificant questions, for if there is a God, as I believe there is, and indeed many, if not most, of us here believe there is, then surely we want a true and accurate knowledge of who that God is. Well, seeking knowledge of God is what we call simply theology. Theology, technical word, is about seeking knowledge of God. Now, theology sometimes gets a bad rap, I have to say that. Of course, there are skeptics who think that any attempt to understand God or describe God or gods of any kind is a waste of time. Robert Heinlein, who is the grandfather of science fiction writing, once wrote, "Theology is searching in a dark cellar at midnight for a black cat that isn't there." Futile. Impossible. I've often heard Christians express contempt for the project of theology, as if it were somehow an impertinent intellectual exercise to put God under a microscope and seek to understand him in all his complexity. But when you think about it, if you are someone who believes in God, if you are someone who ventures to say anything about God, then you are engaged in theology. We are all, in that sense, theologians, if we have a view at all about who God is. We all claim, I think, to have some conception about who God is, some understanding of who God is and what he is like. But the question for us, the question we really want to think hard about is this: is our understanding of God accurate? Is it accurate? How close to the truth is it? I don't claim at all, and won't throughout this sermon series, to claim that we can have perfect 100% knowledge of God. But the question is, how accurate is the knowledge of God we have? Is who we think God is who God is? Is who we think God is based on truth? Or is the God we believe in really just a product of our own imaginings, or a projection of our own values or priorities? Who is this God we claim to know? Well, in the coming weeks, we're going to be wrestling with this and other questions because, friends, it matters. Theology matters. It matters because knowledge of God prevents us from making God in our own image and thinking or speaking of God in ways that simply aren't true. Knowledge of God inspires us, I think, to conform our lives more closely to his ways. And it prevents us from living in ways that are at odds with God's ways. And I think knowledge of God actually gives us our sense of place in the world, our sense of purpose and meaning and direction. And the extent to which we have accurate knowledge of God will affect that sense of purpose and direction we have in life. But as we embark on this study of God, I think it's important for us to distinguish right up front between what you might call the knowledge of God and knowing God. I think it's possible to have knowledge about God without actually knowing God. I wonder if you sense a difference in that as I say those words. I think it is the same with human relationships. I think it is possible, and you can all relate to this, I'm sure, it's possible to know about certain people. There might be celebrities or sports stars or historical figures that you've researched and read about, seen YouTube clips about. You might know lots about someone's life, but unless you've ever met them and come to know them, you can't know them deeply like a friend can. There's knowing in a relational sense. And we are talking about this in relation to God. There's knowing about God and there's knowing God. And so in this series, we're going to explore who God is, what he is like, what are his attributes, his characteristics. Week in, week out, we'll choose another attribute or characteristic. We're going to build up a knowledge base of God, about God. But the question is, what do we do with that knowledge? It's one thing to know about God. What are we going to do with it? Where does it lead us? Well, knowledge about God ought to lead us to knowledge of God. And more than that, it ought to lead us, as Simon said at the beginning of our service today, it ought to lead us to the praise and worship of God. There is a point to knowing God. And that point is to grow and to flourish in our relationship with him and in our response to him. That's our ultimate aim in this series, to know God better, to have a deeper, richer, more fulfilling relationship with him. It's kind of always the aim, isn't it? But that's the specific aim of this series. And I think our title up there on the screen really captures this aim for us. We're calling this series, Behold Your God. There's a sense in which each week we want to commend to you, to one another, God, and say, behold, friends, your God, as we look at his nature and his character. We want to kind of behold God and go, wow, I've never really seen that before. I've never really thought about that before. I'm seeing God anew. God is amazing. He is extraordinary. You know, much like we might gasp in wonder at an incredible sunset. or in the presence of a great work of art, we might go, wow. Our hope is that we have that same experience of God week in and week out during this series. I really want this series to refresh, to enliven, and also to enlarge our view of God. I wonder if sometimes our vision of God is actually too small. I wonder if we do have too small a view of God, too domesticated a view of God, a view of God that fits simply and easily into my life. Well, I want us to enlarge our vision of God during this series. We're going to pause. We're going to sing. You know, when I do this, don't you think, uh-oh, there's a long sermon to come. I'm going to pause, and during the song, I want you to reflect on this. What do you think is the Bible's most basic doctrine? A doctrine is a teaching, okay? What do you think, if you were to boil it down, the Bible's most basic doctrine about God, the most basic teaching about God that you would find in the Bible, what is it? Have a think as you sing this song, Grace Awaiting Me. Let's stand and we'll sing. Well, I wonder what you came up with. What is the Bible's most basic doctrine about God? Where is the best place to start? Well, let me end the mystery. It is this, that there is a God. Did anyone come up with that one? That there is a God is the Bible's most basic teaching about God. It's so basic that the Bible never seeks to prove it. The Bible never engages in apologetics, seeking to convince people, 3 proofs for God's existence. It always assumes it. From the very beginning, it is assumed. You know how the Bible begins with these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Those are the first words of the biblical story right there at the beginning of Genesis. Now, that is not just a chronological statement about God being there first in the beginning. It's also a theological statement about God's priority in the universe. He is first, before and above all things. Now, we don't blink when we read those words, in the beginning God. But implied in those words is more than that there is just a God, but that there is only one God. That's what's implied in those words. It is one of the most consistent and fundamental themes of the Bible. From beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible claims that there is just one Creator, one Lord of the world. Hear the prophet Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, in chapter 45, beginning at verse 5. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. It's very emphatic, isn't it? The repetition is unmissable, unmistakable. Monotheism, it's another technical word. Theology is the first technical word we've introduced today. Monotheism is the next. It's simply pulling together 2 words into one, which mean belief in one God. Well, monotheism is the Bible's most basic doctrine, and it's the starting point for any discussion about the nature and the character of God. This reality is reflected in a Hebrew, a Jewish profession of faith known as the Shema. Old Testament Jews proclaimed the Shema. Modern Jews today will also say the Shema. It captures a Jewish, Hebrew, the most basic statement of belief in God. From Deuteronomy chapter 6, it reads like this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You might have heard it. That's the Shema. This was the foundational confession of God's Old Testament people, and it captures the Bible's most basic doctrine. Now, at one level, the phrase to say that the Lord is one is a simple mathematical observation, okay? It is to say that God is unique. He is a one-off. He's a singularity. As Isaiah says, there is no other. Now, of course, that was a controversial claim in the ancient world, where polytheism, belief in many gods, was the prevailing worldview. The Hebrews, the Old Testament people of God, were unique in their world, in the ancient Near East, for around them were peoples, cultures, countries that subscribed to belief in many gods. Their belief in one God was unusual. Most cultures and religions of the time would worship multiple gods. And they believed that these multiple gods, through their interplay, brought about almost by accident the universe and control quite chaotically the affairs of people's daily lives. Well, to say that there is one God invited ridicule. It invited contempt and scorn in the ancient world. I mean, you actually see that reflected sometimes in the pages of the Old Testament, as it can today. To proclaim, to profess to modern pluralist people that there is one God is an offence. It is to many today an arrogant claim. We live in a pluralistic society, a society that embraces all cultures, all religions, all peoples, a country that embraces immigration, a country that loves a mix, a plurality of people and culture and religions. It is arrogant to say, the God I believe in is the one true God. Are you saying that others are wrong? You can't say that today, can you? And then there are the atheists, of course, who deny all claims about the divine. One God or many gods, they don't believe in any of them. But to say that the Lord is one isn't just a mathematical observation pointing to God's uniqueness, it is also a relational observation that says something about God's character. The scholars point out here that the Hebrew word for one says something about God's essential nature. Perhaps rendering it with a capital O helps make the point. To say that God is one implies a unity of will and of purpose, that God is not inwardly divided, that at his core God is always consistent, unchangeable, faithful, perfectly true to himself in all that he is and does. To say that God is one speaks of his absolute integrity. And of course, that actually makes him very different from me, and probably from you as well. For we are, as human creatures, so often changeable. We are so often inconsistent in the things we do and say. We are so prone to changing our minds. We're often internally divided, often undecided. That's kind of human experience, isn't it? Perhaps it's important to remember this as we begin this exploration of God, to remember that God is very different from us. Yes, the Bible tells me consistently that I am like God, that I am made in his image, that I bear the image of God. But I must not reverse that and think that God is like me. If I do that, then I will end up, assuredly, with something much less than God. A God who bears my image, a God who just thinks like me, who just agrees with me and what I think. We must be careful not to think that God is like me, even though I am like God. We do well to hear Isaiah's words in the next chapter, the one after I quoted before in Isaiah 46, when he says, I am God, there is none like me. He's unique. He is a singularity. He is one. Well, that's our starting point for this series. The Lord is one. There is no other. And this oneness speaks of God's uniqueness and his absolute integrity. But what does this all mean for us? As I said, it's one thing to know about God. What do we do with our knowledge of God? What's the so what? What's the payoff from knowing these things? How are we to respond to the reality of the one God? Well, I want to suggest two responses: devotion and mission. Two simple responses to the reality that God is one. I quoted from the Shema before, from Deuteronomy. Well, note the command that follows immediately on from it. In fact, you could kind of insert, if you like, a therefore between the white and the yellow text. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Therefore, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. The way we respond to the one true God is with wholehearted, loving devotion, as is only right for the creatures of the Creator. And the logic here is simple. Because there's one God, because he is our Creator and we're his creatures, it follows that we're to acknowledge him in our lives. Not in a cool kind of intellectual, arm's length, hands off kind of way. A kind of acknowledgement that acknowledges his existence but keeps a distance. No. But an up-close, personal, intimate engagement of our whole being, of our heart, soul and strength. That kind of engagement befits the creature in relation to the Creator. Another word we use to describe this kind of whole being engagement, another technical word, ready for it? It's worship. That's what worship is. A whole being engagement with God is what worship is. A wholesale giving of yourself, your talents, your resources, your opportunities in the service of God. It's not something we only do here on Sundays, although we do that. It's something we do in all of life. And such a response to the one God is not grounded in fear or obligation, but in love. A free self-giving, entrusting of ourselves to our Creator. You know, friends, I think it's worth exploring this a little deeper. If there is one God, and he calls us to wholehearted devotion of him, then it actually explains why the Bible takes such a dim view of idolatry. It's why the Bible takes such a dim view of idolatry, the sin of idolatry. You might know that the first two of the 10 commandments given to the Old Testament people of God, the Israelites, speak of idolatry. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Idolatry is to worship or devote yourself to something other than or before the one true God. And this is not just an ancient phenomenon where people bowed down to statues. Idolatry is as present today as it ever has been. And given the condition of our hearts, it's something we do so naturally and sometimes even without knowing. We engage in this sin of idolatry. At its heart, idolatry is about seeking meaning and fulfillment, identity and purpose in things other than God. In things like relationships, in family, in work, in success or achievement, in money or possessions, in status or social standing, or the approval of others, or in body image, or in educational attainment, and the list could go on. And the reality is we so often attach our hearts to these things, often good things in themselves, but we make them ultimate things, the most important things. Things that we just can't live without. Tim Keller is an American pastor, a Presbyterian pastor. He pastors Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. You may have read some of his books. You may have listened to some of his podcasts. In his excellent book, Counterfeit Gods, he says an idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel my life has meaning. If I have that, then I'll know I have value. If I have that, then I'll feel significant and secure. And our idols, whatever they are not harmless. To varying degrees, they will exercise controlling power over our hearts and over our lives. And we know that's happened when we spend our time and our passion and our energy pursuing them or daydreaming about them, when we spend our emotional or financial resources on them without a second thought, or when we sacrifice the things that are truly important in the pursuit of them. Like the pagan idols of ancient times, we effectively end up serving them. And that's what worship is. But it's a misdirected worship. It's idolatry. Friends, allowing our idols to get a foothold in our lives denies the Bible's most basic doctrine, that there is one God before and above all other claims to our devotion. And the only way to free ourselves from our idols is to replace them. We can free ourselves from them. But to free ourselves from them, we need to replace them. As Tim Keller says again, the only way to free ourselves from the destructive influence of counterfeit gods is to turn back to the true one. The living God who revealed himself on the cross is the only Lord who, if you find him, can truly fulfill you, and if you fail him, can truly forgive you. The one God revealed in the person of Jesus Christ calls for our wholehearted, loving devotion. Because no other God or potential source of security or happiness can give us what he can. Real meaning and fulfillment, purpose and identity, hope and a future. Friends, your career can't give you any of that. A relationship can't give you any of that. Your family can't give you any of that. Your exam results can't give you that. Only God can give you those things. Well, while God's oneness calls for our devotion, I said it also inspires us towards mission. Devotion and mission are two implications that come from this teaching about the oneness of God. We heard from Psalm 96 before. It's a psalm that many of you will know. Perhaps you will hear music because there was a song we used to sing in the 90s if you've been in church for as long as me. Sing unto the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day, declare his glory among the nations, his marvellous deeds among all peoples. Now, these words affirm that our most basic response to the one true God is to worship him. Yes, that's what we've been saying. And while they are directed to God's ancient people, the people of Israel, the praises they sing are not a private act of worship. They are not something that they were to be doing far away from the prying eyes of outsiders. For as verse 3 says, they are to declare God's glory among the nations, his marvellous deeds among all peoples. The nations, or the Gentiles if you like, were supposed to hear Israel's songs of praise. Why? Well, so that the Gentiles would join in. So that they would join Israel in worshipping the one true God. For as verses 4 and 5 say, for great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord God made the heavens. Israel's songs of praise were more than just an act of worship for insiders. They were also a powerful testimony to outsiders, all those who were not yet a part of the people of God. Israel's praises when they worshipped were a proclamation to the nations, to the Gentiles, that there was only one God, that he alone is to be feared above all other gods, and that the gods of the nations were nothing but empty idols. Monotheism and mission are closely related. Because there is one Lord, to whom all people belong and owe their allegiance, the worshippers of that Lord are called to promote this reality throughout the world. That's our mission. It's what follows from a belief in the one true God who made the heavens and the earth. There may be many things, friends, that motivate us to promote the gospel, to share our faith with our friends, to speak of God to others, but the most basic motivation of all is that there is only one God worthy of praise. Only one God who deserves the devotion of all people. I wonder if you've ever thought about that's what we do here in church when we gather. We're engaging in that. Has it ever occurred to you that through our singing, through our praises, through the Bible readings and preaching, we are inviting people, anyone who turns up, anyone we might invite, to recognise the one true God who has made himself known in the person of Jesus, and inviting them to join us in worshipping him. Our church gatherings, every Sunday, week in and week out, are a powerful proclamation to the people in this community to give up their idols, to give up the gods of wealth and leisure and lifestyle, and to worship the one true God. And if we've lost that sense, friends, we need to recover it. We ought to see church as a place that we can invite people to so that they will encounter the one true God. Well, I asked at the beginning, among other questions, who is God? Who is this God that we're talking about? What can we know of him? What is he like? Why, apart from being our maker, is he worthy of our devotion? Well, in future weeks, we're going to explore some answers to those questions. We're going to explore more of God's character, more of his nature, more of his actions. But as we do, I hope that we will be encouraged to behold our God, to go, wow, to see him afresh, to have our vision of God refreshed, enlivened and enlarged, so that we might respond to him with wholehearted, loving devotion, and that we might be inspired to make him known in the world. How about we pray? Gracious God, help us in these coming weeks to learn about you, who you are, what it is you've done for us, where you are taking us. But more than that, help us to come to know you more deeply. Will you refresh and enliven and enlarge our view of who you are? Might our study of you lead to an ever greater praise and worship of you. Help us in all we do to make you known in what we say and what we do. And it's in Jesus' great name we pray. Amen.